audience is all there. And I wanted to say hello to everybody and introduce myself. I am Joshua Landis and have just been appointed this year as the head of the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And before introducing our two illustrious speakers, it's my pleasure to thank the Farzaneh brothers, Mohammed and Jalal, for their generous support of the College of International Studies and the University of Oklahoma at large. Not only have they been the key to building the Farzaneh Family Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, which now has 4 tenure track positions and a Persian instructor, but they fund an architecture program and a fine Persian music series and many other things at the University of Oklahoma. So we're extremely lucky to have such farsighted and committed patrons. I'd also like to thank Marjan Sarafipur, who has helped to set up this program today, and Stephanie Sager, who has also helped us a lot. Now, our speakers today are Professors Vali Nasr, and Gregory Goss. And I don't really need to introduce them, but I'm going to do a little bit of introduction because it would be terribly remiss if I didn't. They both have led such stellar careers that most of us in this world are jealous of them because they've really been able to combine the best of academia with practice and consultations with the government. Dr. Vali Nasr is the Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle Eastern Studies at the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. For many years, he was Dean of SAIS and has recently just stepped back so he can be with us tonight, thank the Lord. And he has served as senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative of Afghanistan and Pakistan. He has advised many secretaries of state, and he's the author of 4 books, numerous articles, with a particular focus on Iran and the broader Middle East. Professor Gregory Goss is the author of 3 books, many articles. I can't even begin to count how prolific he is. And he has a particular focus, of course, on the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf. He has also been, every time I go to a think tank or any place in Washington, I bang into Greg Goss. He is ubiquitous and has had the joy and pleasure of being deeply involved in policy as well as a really fine academic. So we can't be more lucky than we are today to have both of you with us. Thank you. Now, let me tell the audience that you can write your questions. We're going to speak for about half an hour. I'm going to ask first 3-4 questions, and then we're going to go to the audience. And if you write it in the Q&A section of then I will be able to read them and ask from those questions for last. We're going to go for an hour and 15 minutes to 15 after the hour. So let us jump in. I'm going to ask 3 questions of both of you. But the first one is addressed to you first, Vali. And that is, and I want both of you to be able to jump in here. If you disagree or you think that something hasn't been covered properly, jump in, interrupt. First question, will Biden sign an Iran agreement? What are the major obstacles to be overcome?
Thank you very much, Josh, for your introduction and for inviting me to this session. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be joining you and Greg, old friends and colleagues on this panel at this time, and also to be coming to the Farzaneh Family Center, about which I've heard a lot. And it's great to be participating in its activities, and I wish it a great deal of success. Now, the short answer I would say is yes. And the reason for it is the following, that the impetus with this administration, I think, pushes them in the direction of at least trying to restore the JCPOA. So first of all, it was a legacy of President Obama that President Trump withdrew from for no good reason other than the fact that he didn't like the deal, and also he wanted a better deal and wanted to erase President Obama's legacy. And therefore there is an impetus within the Democratic Party to want to essentially restore a foreign policy legacy of the Obama administration. Although having said that, a lot has happened between when the United States left and the election. Iran is now enriching a lot more uranium, has moved away from its commitments in the deal. Relations with the United States have deteriorated. The region itself is on a boiler. But this administration has a lot on its plate. We're not back in 2018 or 2016. We're having a COVID pandemic, an economic crisis, political divisions at home. There's a huge agenda on foreign policy out there. And I think the administration would like to reduce tensions in the Middle East, to avoid a war with Iran, which is the most likely cause of a major entanglement in the region. And the easiest way to back away from the edge is to essentially make sure that the Iranians at least adhere to the deal that they signed in 2015. The administration and many would want more from Iran, additional concessions on the nuclear front, serious engagement on changing their policy in the region, perhaps a conversation about their missiles. But the lowest hanging fruit right now is essentially to restore the deal, because as President Obama also understood, the most likely reason the United States might end up in a war in the region, either directly or if Israel starts a war and the United States is dragged into it, is over Iran's nuclear program. So getting the Iranians to adhere to what they have signed in 2015 seems to be a logical first step. However, how do they get there, and whether they can get there is a whole different question that we can talk about.
All right. And Greg, I'm going to ask you the same question. And I want to add to that, how is the Saudi Arabia positioning itself for a Biden-Iran deal? What are the Saudis' main demands, and what are its fears?
Look, I don't think the Saudis can make any demands here. If the United States wants to sign a deal with Iran, just as in the Obama administration, the Biden administration is going to do it. The Saudis cannot stop that. And I don't think that it would be a good idea for us to think that they could stop that. If it's in our national interest to sign a deal with Iran, and I was supportive of the original JCPOA, I think that we should do it. And if the Saudis don't like it, if the Israelis don't like it, we'll talk to them about it. But we don't take orders from our regional partners. We conduct our own national interest. Now, I do think that the Saudis are in a somewhat of a bad position, a worse position than they were in 2015 when the original JCPOA was signed. And I think vis-a-vis the United States, and I think the reason basically is that, like so much of American politics in the last 5, 6, 7 years, relations with Saudi Arabia have become a part of our partisan debate. President Trump embraced Saudi Arabia in a way that no other president has, and particularly embraced the Crown Prince, and was directly involved in the politics within the ruling family that elevated Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, to his current position. And as part of that, the Democratic Party in general began to see Saudi Arabia as not a partner of the United States, but a pro-Republican country. And I think that the Saudis have realized that that's not a good place to be in a two-party system, because the parties always change. And so I think that there's a realization in Riyadh that they have to deal with the Biden administration. They dealt with the Obama administration. They didn't like parts of it. They have to deal with the Biden administration. And I think that given what's happened with the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, with the Yemen war, I think the Saudis realize that the relationship with the Biden administration is going to entail some changes in foreign policy. But I also think the Biden administration, as Vali mentioned, is not looking for crises and fights in the Middle East. They're actually looking, I think, to tamp down potential problems in the Middle East, which is why their first move is to the restoration of JCPOA. And while I think that they want to set up some guardrails for the Saudis, I don't think that they're looking for a big crisis with Saudi Arabia either. We have to remember that these are the people who are running foreign policy in the Biden administration, including the president, have been at this the president's been at it for decades. I don't think that they're looking for a 180-degree shift on Saudi Arabia. I think they're looking for a change in Saudi behavior. And I think that the Saudis grudgingly will accept that.
Okay, very good. Anything you want to add to that, Vali, before we go to our next question?
No, I agree with Greg, although I want to ask him in the sense of, the sensitivities that the Saudis have in any kind of a shift in relations between Iran and the US, and if JCPOA or continued conversation with Iran may change, again, the US position in the Middle East, and if that bothers the Saudis. And secondly, if he thinks that the Saudis would be amenable to engaging on Yemen, which is also a big issue for at least the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, has been pushing on this issue hugely.
Yeah, I mean, I'll only take the second one first. I think the Saudis are ready to engage on Yemen. I think that the issue for the United States is the only player who would have any influence on the Houthis is Iran. So you're going to have to bring the Iranians into this discussion somehow, because the Saudis can't fight the Houthis out of Sana'a. My guess is that the Saudi opening position is that the Houthis would have to leave Sana'a. But why should they? They have it, and they can't be driven out. On the first question, I think there's a structural issue in here, right? The weaker party in any alliance kind of vacillates between two fears. One is the fear of entrapment, that my more powerful partner is going to get me involved in a war that I don't want to be involved in. And I'm old enough to have heard plenty of people on the Arab side of the Gulf talk about when the United States is taking a confrontational stance toward Iran, we don't want to be dragged into a war, your war with Iran. And the other pole of those fears is abandonment. Right? When the United States is negotiating with Iran and trying to develop perhaps a new relationship with Iran, they feel that their interests will be abandoned. I think that that's just built into the structure of the relationship. It's very, very similar to the way many of our European allies felt during the Cold War, when the United States would either be confrontational with the Soviet Union or during periods of détente. So that's baked in the cake. It's not going to change. The United States has reassured its Gulf allies, including Saudi Arabia, numerous times in the past. And when my friends in the Gulf say to me, you Americans are abandoning us, either because we're talking to Iran, or we have presidential candidates who say that they want to end the endless wars and leave the Middle East, my answer to them is always, when Camp Arifjan in Kuwait closes down, when the Fifth Fleet leaves Bahrain, when Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar closes down, when the military facilities arrangements in the United Arab Emirates and Oman end, then we can talk about America abandoning you. But I don't see any prospect that that's going to happen.
Okay. Question number 2, Vali. 15 years ago, you made a big splash with your book, The Shiite Revival. You captured the dramatic changes that were taking place in this growing struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as between their allies among Shia and Sunnis over the region. Today, Sunni Arab society, at least in the north, is in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, is in shambles, very disorganized, and it's been pulverized in Syria and Iraq. Shia authorities, or those allied with them, are in the driver's seat in the northern Middle East. The Arab world has never been more fragmented and never weaker, which allows Iran and Turkey to fill this power vacuum. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries have teamed up with Israel as a result, much to Washington's satisfaction. So, and America's ambassador, James Jeffrey, to special envoy to Syria and to counter ISIS, recently said that his mission was to develop a quagmire for Iran and Russia in this Shia crescent, if we will. Has this victory for the Shia been a Pyrrhic victory? How do you foresee this new security architecture developing in the future, with an Iranian influence north and a Saudi, Israeli, American muscle in the south of the Middle East?
It's a very good question, and it's a very complex. The situation is too complex for very sort of a elegant, simple answer. I would say that when the United States removed Saddam Hussein, and we had the beginnings of a sectarian conflict in Iraq, which was then not quite understood in the West, and then that was followed by events in Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, which during the Arab Spring, which heightened this issue of a Shia-Sunni conflict. It suggested that there is a strategic dimension to this identity in the region. I mean, I generally don't think that people are going to battle over theology, but largely it comes down to how identity plays in domestic politics of these countries, who rules, who's the follower, who gets the resources, who doesn't, and then regionally, who is whose client, and who has a natural affinity with whom. So the Shias did well, largely, I think, because the region was so dominated by Sunnis, even in places where Sunnis were a minority, like other than Syria, where actually the reverse was true. But let's say in Iraq or in Bahrain or in Yemen, where Shias were a majority, they were able to either change the structures or seriously threaten them. It looked like the glass was half full for the Shias compared to before 2003, when there was a solid, let's say, Sunni Arab structure in the region, managed by authoritarian regimes that could rule their societies, regardless of what the composition of those societies were. And that after 2003 and into post 2011, it looked like Iran made steady gains. It was able to expand its Shia alliances in Yemen, in Iraq, and then it was able to prevent the collapse of a minority Shia ally in Syria to a dominant Sunni population. But I also think they reached the limit of how far they could go. In other words, it's true that there are no Arab victories in Syria or Yemen, but the Iranians also were not able to prevent a consolidation of anti-Iranian, anti-Shia opinion among the Arab populations, which is costly to them down the line, because Iran initially very much relied on some degree of soft power in the Arab world. The high point of this was during President Ahmadinejad's time, when an Al-Ahram poll in Cairo found him to be the most popular leader in the Middle East, followed by Hassan Nasrallah.
Exactly.
Now we're far away from that. I mean, now there is a lot of cynicism in the Arab world. Arab governments feel quite comfortable in being very anti-Iranian with their own populations and blaming Syria and a lot of the ills of the Middle East on the Iranian machinations. So it's not as if Iran really has won hands down. I think there is a limit to its victory. And it's also very clear that Iran cannot easily control these territories. It can wage war there. It can have military victories, but it's not necessarily capable of ruling over Arabs. So I think we've also reached the limits of that, but these conflicts are still there. Yemen very much has a sectarian dimension to it. Syria has a sectarian dimension. Lebanon has a sectarian dimension. This hasn't gone away. Now, the other side of this is that I think there are other fissures that have opened, which is an intra-Sunni clash as well. This competition between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, not only over influence over the Arab world, but over the brotherhood version of Islam versus what the Persian Gulf monarchies prefer, which then really came down into the blockade over Qatar. But even at some levels, the rhetoric between UAE, Saudi Arabia, and President Erdogan of Turkey has really been about who is the religious leader of the Sunnis. I mean, at one point, UAE's ruler was questioning, Turkish what the Turks did when they controlled Mecca. and whether they were actually legitimate and appropriate governors of the two holy cities, which raised the ire of the Ottoman Sultan to be the way that Erdogan is posturing. So that fissure is also means that there's not a solid Sunni position. Turkey's relationship with Iran is more of a co-opetition. They agree and disagree on Syria, on Azerbaijan, on Qatar. Turkey and its allies, and including the Brotherhood and Qatar, have been closer to Iran in recent times than they have been to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and its allies. So I would say that we can't. Middle East is now hopelessly divided. I would say in an almost medieval European sense of great power rivalry. Israel is also now jumped into the fray. So you have axes forming, and there are competitions over turf and influence that are unfolding. And these are not about necessarily sectarian issues, but sectarian issues are essentially an instrument of power and will play a role in there. And will, but we're in for a period of this until we have much clearer order emerge out of the current chaos in the Levant.
Greg, I'm going to ask you. Thank you for that good answer, Greg. I'm going to ask you the same question. You know, can the KSA, can Saudi Arabia capitalize on these Abrahamic treaties of peace that the Biden administration says it's going to continue? And is that how are they going to move forward? Will they try to rebuild an Arab bloc to balance the Persians, or will they go with Israel? And can they do both?
So what I'm going to say is just a gloss on Vali's analysis, which I agree with. But let's be honest about a couple of things. The Abraham Accords are not peace agreements, right? They're not stopping that horrible Emirati-Israeli war. They're recognition agreements, and they don't change the geopolitics of the region one iota. Right? The Israelis were dealing with the Emiratis, with the Saudis behind the scenes and under the table for some time, brought together by their common fear of Iranian expansionism and Iranian influence in the region. So, I don't discount the importance of Arab states, more Arab states recognizing Israel. I think in the long term that's part of the cultural change that's going to happen in the region, and as Israel just becomes another Middle Eastern state. But let's not exaggerate their importance. I think that geopolitically they're almost insignificant. Secondly, I agree with the way Vali laid this out, but I have a different starting point. The contest for influence in the region these days is not about military power. I don't think anyone fears the Iranian army crossing over their borders and taking them over. The contest for influence in the region stems from the broken politics of so many Arab states. Right? The collapse of the state made these places into playing fields for regional actors. And I think the reason that the Iranians have been doing so well in so many of them is because they've been able to develop very strong relations with their clients, their allies. They've developed partners who want to partner with them, who are happy to be extensions of Iranian influence because they have an ideological commitment. And sectarianism is part of it, but to me, sectarianism is a bottom-up phenomenon of the breaking of these states, not a top-down phenomenon imposed by the Iranians and the Saudis. The problem for the Saudis is that their most quote-unquote natural ideological allies in these fights hate the Saudis and want to kill them, right? The Salafi jihadist movements are not pro-Saudi, right? You can say that there's an ideological affinity, but Al-Qaeda and ISIS hate the Saudis and want to kill them. So the Saudis don't have reliable allies here. What they're good at is dealing state to state. They're good at dealing with governments, right? The decades-long project of Saudi Arabia began back in the 60s to spread the Salafi interpretation of Islam they've lost control of it and it's backfired on them. So what are the Saudis able to do? Probably the biggest victory for the Saudis in this contest for influence was against Turkey, not against Iran when they were able to dish out the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt and in their support for the military coup that brought General Sisi to power. So the problem for the Saudis is they don't have any natural allies here. They're good at state to state, but they're not good at dealing in the confused and difficult politics of these civil war environments. You can just see it in Yemen. They don't have reliable allies in Yemen, right? The problem for the Turks is that the Muslim Brotherhood has basically lost most of the political fights that they've been in. But the Turks are still in there pitching, right? Between Libya, where Iran, of course, is not involved, but some of the Gulf states are, not so much Saudi, and Egypt's involved. And there's even talk about the Turks wanting to be involved in Yemen. Why, I don't know. But I think that until, when we talk about order, the order is domestic, right? When Syria and Iraq were stable, if very unattractive and fierce states, we weren't talking about the spread of Iranian influence, right? Iran's big victory, its original victory, was in Lebanon, you know, after 15 years of civil war and a classically weak state. And now Iranian influence in Yemen, where a classically weak state has fallen apart. Until there is some sense of the reconstitution of domestic authority in these states, they are political vacuums into which the regional powers and some international powers are going to be drawn. And the Iranians have a lot of cards to play. The problem for the United States, frankly, is that we have no idea how to build states, right? We proved that in Iraq. We have no idea how to do this. And the examples of history is that states are built by really nasty and really violent men. And it won't be pretty, the reconstruction of these states, as we're seeing in Syria right now. So I think that the regional crisis goes on for quite a while, because I don't see these states becoming kind of solid, real entities that can resist external interventions.
All right. Just as a follow-up to that, a little bit, Turkey's entrance into the Middle East over the last decade or so, moving into Azerbaijan against the Armenians in order to take that border with Iran, pushing into Syria and being used by the United States, not used, but partnering with the United States in order to weaken Assad and Iran, in a sense, in Syria. How does this, how does this Turkish entrance change things? This has got to be a short answers to this. How do they change things for each of your country?
Well, first of all, Turkey is a very major actor. So its entrance definitely creates turbulence, at least in terms of our foreign policy. The way we've thought about the Middle East being between just Iran and the Arabs, or Iran and Saudi Arabia, now is not actually correct. You have a third gorilla in the ring right now, and in fact, privately, UAE would say that their deal with Israel was as much about Iran as it was about Turkey. Turkey, in addition, has also become the most destabilizing actor because it's the most unpredictable. I mean, in some ways, the Israelis and the Iranians know each other's games well. These are sort of old adversaries. But what Turkey wants, where it will act, is actually right now not known. I mean, it's sudden foray into Azerbaijan, ending what was a frozen conflict for a very long time so decisively, wrong-footed Iran completely, and wrong-footed Russia to some extent. And also, we talk a lot about the Iranian mischief in the region, but let's not forget, Greg pointed to Libya, to places that Turkey's going that you can't even see why they're going there. But Turkey's currently is the only country that's militarily occupying Arab lands, in a sense. If you're setting aside, the old Israeli occupation of Golan, I mean, they're occupying northern Syria. They may not leave that for a very long time. I mean, we might end up with a Cyprus scenario, where you're going to just sit there for a period of time. And also, it is a question as to whether Turkey is still feels itself bound by the treaties that it signed at the end of World War I? Does it actually really see Syria and all the way down to Mosul as a kind of a Turkish near abroad sphere of influence? And then finally, I want to say to add to what Greg was saying, if when the three of us were in graduate school and we were studying the Middle East, the center of gravity and power in the Middle East was the Arab world. That's where the focus was. You had these giant countries, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, as well as the bloc of Arabs that basically dominated this region. At some point, their power was such that Turkey, Israel, and Iran had to ally together with Ethiopia in order to sort of contain what was this major Arab power center in the region. Now it's almost the reverse. It is the real power players in this region, in my opinion, particularly based on what Greg said, the inherent weaknesses of Saudi Arabia, is that the real power players are Israel, Turkey, and Iran. And even I would say in this Abrahamic Accord, in a way, it looks like, and Greg can correct me, that Saudi Arabia is not even in it, but UAE and Bahrain and others are actually junior partners to what will be essentially an Israeli defined, if you were say, position vis-a-vis Turkey and Iran. So, and I think some of this will come down to Syria because it borders on two of these powers, and Iran is also another big power. So the fight over Syria probably will be a fight between these three big powers, and Saudis obviously are not engaged in Syria in the same manner. But I think Turkey's hasn't come into the Middle East to leave. And I think it's going to expand its position in northern Lebanon. It's already sort of filling in for what the Saudis have left behind. It's not going to leave Syria easily. There are points of contention with Iran, and there are points of contention it has with Israel. And so, we're going to see this rivalry between these three unfold.
Greg?
Yeah, I think that the Saudis view the Turks as potential rivals. I mean, not only geopolitically, but the model of Islamist politics that Erdogan represents is much more of a threat to Saudi Arabia than than Velayat al-Faqih is, right? There's just not enough Shia in Saudi Arabia to really threaten the regime. But the idea of bottom-up Sunni activism is something that does have potential in Saudi Arabia. I think the Saudi regime is relatively stable. I always have, but that's the more serious threat than either Iranian quote unquote export of the revolution or an ISIS, extreme Salafi jihadist model. It in fact kind of harkens back to the 60s when it was more of an Arab nationalist threat, but a Muslim Brotherhood style threat is something that Saudi Arabia believes it has experienced. I mean, after 9/11, there was a lot of blame to the Muslim Brotherhood, which I don't think was accurate, but it was the way that Saudi leaders portrayed what went wrong with Islam in the Arab world that generated this Al-Qaeda phenomenon. I think Vali's point about Israel is so interesting. The Israelis tried to develop clients in the Arab world in the 80s, right? This was the Lebanese Civil War. They they patronized the Phalange and the Gemayel family. Their invasion made Bashir al-Gemayel president of Lebanon. And that all collapsed. And I think Israelis view that as a failed effort. And so even though Israel is without a doubt the strongest military power in the region, it has had so little influence on what's going on since the Arab Spring, right? Since the breaking open of these countries, that it really does lead one to think about what does power, how does one define power in the current contest, balance of power contest in the Middle East? And the Israelis, they have enormous military power, and they use it in Syria against Iranian and pro-Iranian positions, but they don't have the tickets to play in the games that are going to determine who's going to run the Middle East, because they don't have the local clients.
Greg, let me interrupt you right here. And Glenn Robinson has written in a question here, which really fits into this a little bit. And he's asking, in this regional contest between Iran and Saudi Arabia in recent years, Iran is always winning. They've won in Lebanon and Yemen and Qatar. So it just goes right down the line. Why is that? Why? And I guess you've partly answered that, Greg. But why?
Tell Glenn to listen. I just answered that question.
Yeah. Okay. But what else would you like to say? To what extent is, Vali? How would you answer that question?
Well, I would say it's correct. I mean, Greg said at the very beginning that the Iranians had invested in the right things in the region. They had invested in asymmetric capabilities. They had invested in militias. They had a ground game of what would happen if states collapse. And I think they learned a lot from Iraq, that having big militaries trying to confront the United States or Israel, whose militaries are much technologically superior, is a fool's errand. The United States can dismantle a military in 2 weeks, but then it couldn't deal with the insurgency. So the Iranians were well placed to play that game, and I think everybody, and in fact the Turks are also learning, trying to sort of find clients and try to identify clients. I think where Saudi Arabia defeated Iran was in Washington. I mean, the Saudi and UAE played a very effective game in preventing the Obama administration to take any additional steps against Iran. They played a critical role in bringing the United States out of JCPOA. They played a supportive role in putting Iran on the worst and harshest economic sanctions and hardship in more than I would say century that the country has suffered, going back to World War II. And they were very successful in problematizing everything about Iran's activities in the region, its missiles, its politics. In other words, they were very effective to that extent. Now, it's a good question for us to discuss that. How much of the fate of the region actually really is decided in Washington? I mean, if the United States is really the main obstacle ultimately to expansion of Iranian influence through its use of economic power and the presence of all these bases that Greg enumerated, and also the ability, and we may get that again in 4 years' time. That's not a given, that you might have another president who's very happy to assassinate Iranian commanders, nuclear scientists, and fly B-52 bombers over the country. So to that extent, the Saudis have been successful. And again, we're seeing them flex their muscles again, even despite all of the problems that they have with their own individual problems with the Democratic Party and new administration. In cooperation with Israel, with the Republican Party, with UAE, they are mobilizing against the United States engaging Iran. They may not be able to prevent it, but they're going to try to make it as small steps as possible. So I just want to finish by saying, Greg, that the Iranians haven't figured out how to deal with. They're very good at the ground game in the Middle East, but they simply cannot manage what they need outside of the Middle East.
I wouldn't overestimate Saudi influence in DC. They have the best ally one can have in DC because they work with the Israelis on
That's
these
right.
questions
That's
about
right.
Iran. I think that it's the days when the Saudis had privileged access to the White House are over, at least for a while. I mean, they certainly had privileged access to the White House in the Trump administration, but I cannot imagine in a Biden administration that that's going to happen. But I think that in terms of U.S. policy toward Iran, people who see Iran as a threat to Israel are probably I would say much more important in both the politics of the Republican Party and in the Congress than the kind of elite level think tank level UAE, Saudi lobbying that goes on in DC. If I had to choose between those two, I'd take the Israelis every time.
Let me jump in and ask, combine two questions. One from Gary Sick, who's here from New York, and another Farzad Khalili. And Gary Sick asks, you know, President Biden has repeatedly said that he wants to join the Iran deal again, but many of the people that he's appointed, he underlines, speak with one voice saying that this is going to take a long time. And the reality is that he has only a small window of opportunity due to the Iranian calendar. In the meantime, B-52s are flying over. American defense people are going to Washington to open up new bases and so forth. Khalili brings up the same question, but he says, do you think Iran and the U.S. will reach a deal before the Iranian presidential election? And if a hardliner gets elected, will a hardliner in Iran want a deal? And will they be able to negotiate with Washington? So let me throw that out to you, Vali, first. I
think the latter part I'll answer first. I think a hardliner is much more likely to want to deal with Washington after the elections in Iran than before. Because the sooner the election in Iran, the sooner an opening between Iran and the United States happens, the more impact it might have on the presidential elections in Iran. And yes, Iran does not have democratic elections, but if a serious moderate runs, there could be scenarios in which, again, you'll have a high turnout of support for him if the Iranian public think that there is an opportunity to have a significant change in their own economic situation and end Iran's isolation. We saw that with both Rouhani elections. And if you have a high turnout and enthusiasm, it makes it very difficult for a repeat of 2009 in Iran. So hardliners actually would prefer this to drag out as close as possible to the elections and perhaps not happen until after they come in. That does not mean that hardliners necessarily will deal or be easy to deal with, but I think right now they have a domestic incentive in addition to an international one for why they don't want to deal. And but I would say that Gary's correct. I mean, even though I said that the Biden administration, it is logical for them to want to go back to the deal to tamp down tensions in the Middle East, and President Biden, even as a president-elect, wrote an op-ed in CNN saying he would do that. But the devil is in the detail. There is no trust between the two countries. There is no channel of communication and coordination. Who takes the first step? How do you verify that Iran has gone back? There is a very hostile political environment in both countries. And so there is a lot of, if you would, headwinds against this working out. However, I think it's possible to restore a deal that the United States has signed on to, and Iran is still technically within that deal. So it's actually getting Iran to comply with a deal that it's in is easier than trying to get it to sign a completely new deal. And if the United States is going to look at Iran being closer to breakout, Israelis getting jittery, we're back to an imminent war in the region. I think that the logic is that the United States will try to find its way into the deal. But as Gary pointed out, there's a lot of places where this can go off the rails, and things can go in a wrong direction. Certainly, history is replete with sort of people sleepwalking into conflicts that they didn't originally intend to have. But I would say that where I would say differently than Gary put it, we're hearing a lot from the administration, but in confirmation hearings, et cetera, which sound a lot more hawkish, we haven't seen an actual statement and an actual step by the administration. But everybody who's in this administration either was part of JCPOA or was favorable to JCPOA. Even the more hawkish voices on Iran sat across the table. So if you looked at Brett McGurk, who's now the Middle East coordinator, he negotiated prisoner release with Iran. Wendy Sherman, Jake Sullivan were both part of the negotiation team. Bill Burns was an early participant in the negotiations and was supportive of it. and John Kerry, who, although his portfolio is not Middle East, but still, I'm sure, has opinions on this, was part of the Iran deal. So I don't think that the sort of the default position of the people in the administration is to say that this is a bad deal. We should have never signed it, and we should seek a new deal. I think they are the people who signed this deal, supported it. They are their own record is one that thought that this was a good deal, not perfect, but a good deal, one that protected America's interests and still could. And I think this is as friendly, as JCPOA friendly a team that you could have envisioned in this administration.
Greg, I'm going to take you on a little different tangent here, because I've got two questions for you. One from Barnett Rubin, who asks, what's going to happen, Greg, if this administration releases and declassifies the intelligence report that will directly implicate the Crown Prince in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi? And the second question is from Abdullah Asiri, who asks, do you think that the Biden administration will try to influence Saudi domestic politics towards restoring the traditional royal wings alliance? And if so, what figures might they talk to? Is the Biden administration going to try to play domestic politics in Saudi Arabia? So those two questions are really aimed for you.
Yeah. So the declassification on the Crown Prince's involvement in the Khashoggi killing, I have to tell you, I don't think it makes that much difference, just because I think everyone basically knows that any operation like that in Saudi Arabia is not done without some kind of approval from the top. I don't think it changes anybody's beliefs about how and why that horrible thing happened. It might put the Crown Prince in some legal jeopardy in the American court system, which of course is I'm far out of my competence to talk about that. But I don't think it changes the realities of the fact that the United States is not looking for a big blow up with Saudi Arabia at a time when it is trying to, I think, as Vali said back when we began, is trying to tamp down, not heat up the region. And I feel the same way about speculation that the Biden administration might want to play into Saudi domestic politics. I thought that was a horrible mistake by the Trump administration. I think that it increased the prospects that of what we've seen, which is the partisanization, if you will, of the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. And frankly, I don't think that we do it very well when we try to get involved in the domestic politics of regimes. The number of cock-ups that the United States has been involved in, even ones that seem quote unquote successful at the beginning, which I don't think I have to reference the most obvious one to people who have tuned into the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies, right? But even far afield as Vietnam with Diem and Arbenz in Guatemala. We mess it up when we try to go in and play these kinds of politics. It was a mistake for the Trump administration to do so. It would be a mistake for the Biden administration to do so, because it does appear to me that MBS's position in the regime, to the extent that we can tell, is pretty solid. And if you go in and start messing around, it gives him all sorts of incentives, not to cooperate on Yemen if you want an initiative on Yemen, and to become a spoiler for American plans in the region. And I think it would be a really bad idea.
Okay, let me ask, I've got three questions here I'm going to throw out very quickly about relations between your two countries and different neighbors. One, Vahid Moussaoui asks, what is likely to be Iran's relationship with Afghanistan? Another asks about Pakistan. are Saudi Arabia and Iran going to both compete for influence in Pakistan? And the third is from Kamil Atrakshi, a Syrian, and I have to get a Syrian question in here. Is a renewal of the Iran agreement going to help Syria? Will it affect Washington's present policy of maximum pressure on Syria and sanctions on Syria, or is this administration likely to keep the pressure on Syria despite coming to some agreement with Iran? So Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria. Let's start with Vali.
Sure. So on Afghanistan, Iran obviously has deep people-to-people economic relations with Afghanistan, which keeps the relationship between the two countries alive below the government level. But I think the relations with Afghanistan going forward would greatly depend on what's the form of the government that will be in Kabul. That's right now being negotiated. I think Iranians have a worry about the Taliban having the run of the show in Kabul and trying to reinstate a very draconian Sunni emirate again. They're also worried about civil war if things go awry, largely because it would mean more refugees and the like. But I think their default position is try to work with whoever's in Kabul. It's their national interest is best protected by conflicts. Afghanistan not being in conflict with Iran, and things not spilling over into Iran. Afghanistan is a place where United States will need to talk to Iran. Right now, during the Trump administration, that was not feasible. I think if there's movement on JCPOA, it might open a window in which Iran and the United States could engage, if not bilaterally, multilaterally, to talk about Afghanistan. On Pakistan, I think it's actually interesting, and I would like to hear what Greg thinks. I mean, there's this Iran long time ago understood that, Pakistan's sympathies lies with Saudi Arabia. It has a very large Sunni population that over the years has become much more hardened in its views. There are some very strong sectarian positions. And even though Pakistan is the world's second largest Shia country, still the Shias are too small a minority to really be a crutch for Iran. And trying to play the Shia card in Pakistan is only going to put the Shias of that country in danger. It's going to only rile up the radical voices to go after them. But having said that, there is a sense that the relations between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are now shaky because of MBS having a very different philosophy of that relationship. He has canceled loans to Pakistan. He's been quite difficult with Pakistan. And then on the other hand, Iran does see a room for it to cooperate with Pakistan over the final shape of Afghanistan. And particularly if the United States is going to leave completely, Iran will have to deal with Pakistan directly about Afghan security. And there won't be an obstacle of the United States in the middle for the two of them to work on this. So I think Pakistan, I would say, is a bit more of a black box going forward. Now Syria, again, my sense is that if you have a U.S. administration that is not out for the administration, everything in the Middle East is not about Iran, and it doesn't play broke with every conflict in the region in order to defeat Iran. It does open a door to perhaps remove some of the pressure. And I think if the administration decides that it wants to get diplomatically engaged in finding an end game in Syria, if there's been movement on JCPOA, we may be back to some of the ways in which John Kerry was handling Syria towards the end, the Geneva meetings that also included Iran and Saudi Arabia and other parties in the same room. I mean, those things are not going to happen in the next month or so, but it is conceivable to see that some of those things may begin to happen.
I don't want to talk about Pakistan in front of Vali. He knows a lot more about that than I do. But I do think he's right that one can see some bumps in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. MBS invited the Pakistanis to help the Saudi forces and Emirati forces in Yemen, and the Pakistanis said no, thank you. And I do think that there's a new focus on India as a customer, as a consumer of Saudi energy, of Saudi energy exports, and so I wouldn't say that that historical relationship with Pakistan, where Pakistan was seen as, if you will, strategic depth for Saudi Arabia, where Pakistani troops were stationed in the kingdom, where there was a belief that the Pakistani nuclear forces would be at the disposal in some way, shape, or form of Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure any of that was ever that true in the nuclear side, but I wouldn't say that there's an ironclad Pakistani-Saudi relationship. And given the fiscal situation in Saudi Arabia and the prospects for the oil market, it's not like Saudi Arabia can be an open bank window for Pakistan, as it might have been in sometimes in the past. I think that the whole idea of if U.S.-Iranian relations get better, what does that mean for Syria is really interesting. And Vali's thought went right to John Kerry at the end, and I do think at the end of the Obama administration. And I think that the long game of the Obama administration on JCPOA was that over time Iran would become, if you will, a more cooperative partner in regional political issues. But it didn't have enough time to work. Kerry was not only running around on the Syrian question, he was running around on the Yemen question at the end of the administration, and nothing really came of it. So I'm not optimistic, given the obstacles and the difficulties just to get back into JCPOA that Vali's talked about, that it will immediately lead to, if you will, this kind of long-term goal of the Obama administration to bring Iran more into a diplomatic, if not partnership, at least a diplomatic framework for dealing with regional problems. I think it might be too soon.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to two questions about Israel and China, which we haven't talked about. And a number of people have asked questions about Israel. I'm going to choose one. Miriam Saleh says, will the Saudis try to push for an Israeli strike on Iran? Netanyahu has talked about this in the past. There have been some fierce language out of Israel more recently threatening Iran. Is this something that's likely to happen? What would be Washington's attitude towards it? And what is the Saudi attitude towards it? That's for you.
Oh, is that for me?
Yes, it is.
You want that one, Vali?
You go first.
Look, I wouldn't rule it out, but I certainly think that this administration would be very much against it, and it would enormously complicate Saudi Arabia's relationship with this administration, which is already somewhat unsteady, I think. I think that the Israelis want the Americans to strike Iran. I'm no military strategist, but I think the Israelis have real problems in an effective military strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, at least from what I read in the open sources. I think that there's a desire in many circles to exaggerate the likelihood of this in order to push the United States to do certain things. And so, I cannot rule it out, but I would put it in the category of possible but unlikely.
I would just add to, first of all, I would say that Bibi Netanyahu doesn't really need anybody's encouragement to be hawkish on Iran. In fact, potentially the opposite might be true. I think if you want to say the underbelly or the other side of the Abraham Accords is that the Iranians have told UAE and by implication Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, that if they're hit by Israelis, they may actually retaliate, in Saudi Arabia and UAE. Now that they are allies openly, and there's no sort of deniability that we had nothing to do with it, they're part of the target list. And in fact, that's one reason why UAE and Saudi Arabia may be very cautious in trying to support a bombing campaign, because if a conflict gets out of hand, Abu Dhabi and Dubai are only 90 kilometers from Iran's shores, and we've seen the Iranians have shown willingness to hit targets in these countries. We saw that attack on Aramco during the Trump administration, the attack on Fujairah on tankers. So I wouldn't say that now that they're in an alliance that means that they would be really eager to get the Israelis into a war with Iran, because the likelihood of it washing on their shores is now higher than before.
Okay, let's turn to China. I mean, China is really the big, we really have two questions in this final bit. One is on China and this new China deal that's been talked about so much, but we've seen little action with Iran. How much of a game changer is Iran? Will Iran, as this Biden administration gets tough with China, will China want to gain leverage in Iran in order to how is China going to play in both countries, and how are both countries going to what are they going to do? What is their démarche towards China?
I mean, I don't think the Iranians, first of all, see their engagement with China as a sort of a monogamous claim that then the Chinese will not be doing trade or investments in Saudi Arabia and UAE. I think they purely see it as strategic depth for Iran. Domestically, it's a way for the hardliners and many even in the business community to say that Europe didn't come through after JCPOA. Europe is too vulnerable to the United States, and therefore there's no point in investing our economic future on Europe. And then at the practical level, since 2018, many more Iranian businesses have been buying machinery and semi-manufactured goods that they used to buy in Europe from China. And so those relationships have become much deeper. Now, the Chinese are interested in the Iranian market. The Chinese are also interested in securing, I think, their West Asian border, which is Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia. Iran is also a part of it. Saudi Arabia, UAE are also a part of it. So they are interested. But I think where the Chinese may be really trying to leverage their relationship is actually to elbow India out of Central Asia, out of Iran, and out of Afghanistan. The Indians spent billions of dollars developing the port of Chabahar, which is a sort of a competition for the Chinese port built in Pakistan. They built a road that goes from Chabahar into Afghanistan and then on to Central Asia. It allowed India to have access to Central Asia and Afghanistan going around Pakistan. I mean, Barney Rubin, who's here, has done a lot of work on this. So, if U.S. sanctions ultimately don't let the Indians to have full investment in Chabahar, and the Chinese come in, and they can basically take over all of this infrastructure, and then they would have beachheads both in Pakistan and Iran on the mouth of Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, and so in a long game, it will begin to sort of spread their tentacles into West Asia. On the Iranian side, Iran, unlike Pakistan, does not worry about being pressured by the United States for its friendship with China. Its needs from China are much more immediate, and also the impact of this deal on Iran is very psychological, of basically telling Iran it's not isolated. Now, again, if relations with Europe improve, if there is some degree of lifting of sanctions that brings Western goods into Iran, that dynamic may begin to shift as well.
Great.
So the Saudis sell a lot of oil to the Chinese, and the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in Riyadh is now larger in terms of membership than the American Chamber of Commerce in Riyadh. So the Chinese are selling a lot of stuff in Saudi Arabia. To me, the big question here, and I don't have an answer to it, is what do the Chinese want from the Gulf? I've always said to my classes that a lot will depend on whether the Chinese think like economists or think like political scientists. And if they think like economists, they're happy to free ride on whatever security, quote unquote, security guarantees the Americans provide to the flow of oil, and they'll do business with everybody. If they think like political scientists, they're going to believe that as relations with the United States get worse, which one assumes they will, that they're going to have some kind of strategic, military, political position in the energy areas, in the sea lanes and in the Gulf. I just don't know how the Chinese think. And I wouldn't want to speculate on that. Plenty of people, I think, have studied that. But to me, the bigger question is not what the Iranians think about China and not what the Saudis think about China. It's what China thinks about those places.
Right. Okay. Is the last question I want to ask both of you to wrap this up is, if you have to pick two trends that you see changing the Middle East in the coming decade, coming 10 years, what do you see those trends and how do they affect the countries that you study?
So I'll start. I mean, one is I think the change in the global energy scene will have an impact on the region. Now, there's a lot of debate about what that would be, how it will impact different countries. But I think the Middle East has been oil dependent, both rich countries and even poor countries who relied on contracts or handouts from rich countries or have been oil dependent. If that's not the case going forward, economic austerity could bring significant changes to the region, for the better or for the worse. The second trend I think is demographic, and also I would say the leftover of the Arab Spring. I was just recently reading an article, I think it was in Washington Post, saying that 10 years after the Arab Spring, none of the issues have been resolved. And we also know even in Iran and Turkey, you also have disgruntlement among youth. And we've been talking a lot about all of this rivalry in the region, but of all these actors, I think Israel is the only one I could say that its regime is stable. You could say the prime minister may go, but the system itself is not likely to collapse, implode from within. All the other ones, including Turkey, Iran, and I would say even the Arab countries, are vulnerable to economic pressures, demographic pressures. I would say the Arab Spring kind of issues that blew up. And I just cannot think that a region that's right now focused on rivalry rather than economic transformation in a major way, and then it's being battered by COVID and economic crisis and changing, energy scene. It will look just like this 10 years from now or 20 years from now.
Great, thank you, Greg.
Well, Vali stole the best answers.
He always does that. He's the sneaky guy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that the long-term forecast for what the oil market is going to look like is really very worrying for the countries in the Gulf. For a more developed economy like Turkey, there might be opportunities, but I do think that the Sheikh Himani, the Saudi oil minister of the 70s and into the mid 80s, once said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And I think that as we see changes in both technology and public policy about the use of fossil fuels, that's going to be something that's going to affect all of the countries of the region, even the non-oil producers, because they've been kind of secondary rentiers, being able to offload surplus labor to the oil exporters and being able to get some foreign aid from them. That's not just the Middle East, that's going to affect the subcontinent as well. So I do think that, I mean, for all his faults, MBS in Saudi Arabia saw that. I mean, this ambitious Vision 2030 was based on the notion that in the end, Saudi Arabia is going to have to live with a lower oil price. I agree with Vali that maybe the most important internal issue is the stability of states. I guess I see it as the Lebanonization of the Levant, right? A long-term weakening of state authority, real authority coming down to militias, to local actors, to if you will, warlords, where the capital doesn't control the country. And we've seen this in Lebanon for decades now. So you have a state that's internationally recognized, but not internally coherent. I think that we're going to see that in Syria. We might be seeing that in Iraq. Will that extend elsewhere? Yemen, Libya? I think there's plenty of evidence for that. I think the question is, does some of the more historically stable regimes, like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran, since the revolution, does this kind of diffusion of real authority come to characterize their politics as well? I don't know, but that's the thing that I would look at.
Well, that's a sober way to let's. Is there a good trend that each of you sees in the Middle East? Could we try to end on a positive note and say, where do you draw some hope for one trend, even if it's in the arts or something small, that you look forward to following in the Middle East?
I think the role of women in the societies that I know, obviously women have played a major role in a number of countries in the Middle East. The ones that I'm most familiar with on the Arabian Peninsula, I think that the increased role of women is probably the most positive element. The increased role of women in public life and in economic life is probably the most positive trend right now in that part of the Middle East. I'd say the other positive trend is I don't think America is going to fight any big wars in the Middle East in the near future. And, the American invasion of Iraq, I think the consequences of that have been enormously negative. And I think, while I don't think that America is going to, quote unquote, withdraw from the region, I think we're going to be much less intrusive into the region. And I don't think that's a bad thing either.
Vali, you've got the last word here.
I can see sort of in the very short run, positive things that we can really hang our hat on. I mean, we're seeing a sort of a complete wholesale change of the entire structure that we identify with the region, and that's going to be messy for a while. And I think Greg sort of pointed to some of the worst scenarios that we can see. And I think the region has to plow through that before it could arrive at a better place.
Well, I want to thank both of you. This has been a really exciting discussion. We've had a wonderful audience, a lot of questions. I'm very sorry that we couldn't get to them all. I think we covered the main ideas, and I thank you both deeply. And I thank you on behalf of the Farzanehs, who I know are listening. It's been a lot of fun. So on that, I'll say good night to you all, and until next time.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
Thanks, Josh.
Bye-bye. Nice seeing you, Vali. Bye.
Good night, all.